The decommission notice came on a Thursday, which Commander Sira Voss always thought was a stupid day for anything important to happen. Thursdays had no weight to them. They sat in the middle of the week like an afterthought, beige and forgettable, and the Veth Conclave had apparently decided that the formal rejection of humanity's first diplomatic envoy was exactly the kind of event that deserved a Thursday. She read it twice. Then she folded it, actually folded it, creased it down the center with her thumbnail the way her grandmother used to fold letters before handing them over, a gesture that turned the receiving of information into a small private act, and tucked it into the breast pocket of her uniform. The Veth officer who had delivered it was still standing in the doorway of her quarters aboard the liaison station, watching her with those flat, faceted eyes that never blinked in any pattern a human brain could comfortably track. His name was something that translated roughly as holds the record of costs, and he was third tier in the conclave hierarchy, which meant he was important enough to be the one sent to deliver the notice, and unimportant enough that losing his composure in front of a human wouldn't cost him much. "You are to vacate the station by the end of the third cycle," he said. His translator rendered it in flat, affectless English, but Sira had been here long enough to hear the edges. There was satisfaction in it. The kind of satisfaction that doesn't need to announce itself. Your diplomatic credentials have been suspended. Your access to the conclave networks will be revoked at midnight station time. Sira looked at him for a moment. He stood very straight, the way all high-caste Veth stood, as though gravity were a suggestion they had chosen to politely observe rather than a force they were subject to. His carapace was the deep burgundy of someone who had spent decades in bureaucratic comfort, unmarked by sun or hard labor. The bioluminescent filaments along his jaw pulsed in a slow, rolling pattern she had spent months learning to read. Smugness with an undertone of relief that the unpleasant errand was almost over. "Third cycle," she said. "That's about 6 hours." "Approximately." "Right." She looked around the quarters. 2 years of careful accumulation. The star maps she'd printed and pinned to the curved wall because the holographic displays gave her headaches after long sessions. The small clay pot her niece had made her for the journey, and which sat on the desk holding 3 ink styluses and 1 dried sprig of lavender that had been gray for 8 months, but that she hadn't been able to throw away. The photograph of her team back at the UN Diplomatic Corps. All of them laughing at something she could no longer remember but whose specific quality of laughter she still could, vivid and precise and far away. "I'll need a cargo shuttle for my equipment." The cultural reference library alone is 47 archival drives. A single-occupant transit pod has been allocated. She looked at him again. He pulsed with satisfaction. "1 pod," she said. "1 pod," he confirmed. She nodded slowly. "Okay." She started packing. The liaison station hung at the L4 point between Veth Prime and its largest moon, which was not a generous location for a diplomatic residence, but was the one Sira had chosen herself. The Veth had initially offered her quarters aboard the moon in what they called a diplomatic residence, and what Sira had quickly understood was a comfortable cage. Beautiful, well-provisioned, fitted with every amenity their cultural liaison had determined humans might require, and completely isolated from any meaningful contact with the actual texture of Veth society. She had declined and requested the liaison station instead. This had surprised them. The station was a working facility, a transshipment hub and customs processing node, full of low-caste Veth laborers and junior bureaucrats, and the constant industrial traffic of a civilization going about its ordinary commerce. It smelled like machine oil and the sharp mineral-sweet scent of Veth metabolic exhaust. The corridors were bare functional metal, not carved ceremonial stone. The ambient sound was constant. Footsteps in 4-beat patterns, the rhythmic clang of cargo containers, the hiss and whistle of pressurized systems, the particular subsonic hum of a life support apparatus designed for several thousand inhabitants and making no attempt to conceal the effort. She had loved it. For 22 months she had been visible in that station, present and human and learning. She had studied not just the formal conclave tongue, but the trade dialects, the rough working language the dock laborers used, the slang the junior technicians muttered to each other during shift changes, the formal poetry citations that upper caste Veth inserted into even casual conversation as markers of breeding and education, the way a senior addressed a junior in a genuine teaching moment versus the clipped, tonally dismissive shorthand of the same senior addressing someone they considered beneath their attention. She had made mistakes, countless, sometimes embarrassing, occasionally offensive mistakes, and she had acknowledged them explicitly and kept moving, which was apparently unusual enough that several Veth she interacted with regularly had noted it in their own records. She had traded small gifts in the lower market style, had spent 3 weeks learning which offerings were appropriate for which social tier, had sat through 3 complete cycles of the Festival of Closed Accounts because her cultural attaché had told her it was the right thing to do, and she had gone even though it involved 6 hours of ritual silence and 1 ceremony, where she had apparently been required to bring her own ceremonial stone, and had not known this, and had improvised with a smooth gray piece of hull plating she'd found in a maintenance bay that morning. She had expected the error to be noticed and marked against her. Instead, the hull plating's specific mineral composition had marked her, in pre-consolidation Veth tradition, as someone who worked with their hands, a designation that, in the current era, carried a kind of rough dignity among the working caste Veth that the upper caste attendees at the ceremony had found mildly interesting, and the lower caste attendees had found quietly significant. She had learned about this 2 weeks later from a dock supervisor she'd befriended over months of shared mid-shift coffee, who explained it with what she had come to understand was Veth amusement, which looked like nothing on their faces but lived in the filament patterns. She had thought she was making progress. The formal conclave review 8 weeks ago had suggested otherwise. Humanity's petition for full diplomatic recognition had been tabled, not rejected outright, tabled, with the specific language of the conclave's 13th provision, which meant placed in review pending demonstration of cultural compatibility. It was the diplomatic equivalent of "we'll get back to you," rendered in the formal language of a civilization that had decided centuries ago that courtesy and condescension could wear the same coat. Sira had spent 3 weeks preparing a response. She had addressed their specific stated concerns in precise detail, documented 2 years of cross-cultural engagement through categorized field observations, and attached 41 supporting testimonials from Veth citizens of various castes who had interacted with her directly, dock workers, junior bureaucrats. A retired cultural historian who had been studying her without her awareness for 4 months, and had eventually introduced himself to tell her she was doing several things very wrong and several things surprisingly right, and one retired fleet admiral who had spoken to her over a period of several months about the human-Veth war of proxy contact 40 years ago and had said, in the measured way of someone who chose each word with the precision of someone who had given orders that cost lives, that she reminded him of the kind of soldier he had wished his enemies were. The conclave had received her response on a Monday. The decommission notice had come on Thursday. She packed methodically because that was how she handled things that hurt. She organized the archival drives into their cases in numbered order, cases that were too many for one transit pod, but which she packed anyway because she was not going to leave 47 drives of documented first contact with a sapient alien civilization in a recycling bin on an alien space station. She wrapped the clay pot in the printout of a star map she'd been using as a reference guide, patting it against the walls of the bag with her extra socks. She packed the photograph flat between 2 archival drive cases. She packed the field journals last because she kept reaching for them to add notes and had to make herself stop. She was on her third case when she found the file she had been trying not to think about for 72 hours. The targeting data. It had come to her through a channel she shouldn't have had access to, a back route through the station's cargo management network that she had discovered accidentally 6 months earlier while trying to trace a misfiled equipment requisition that had cost her team 3 weeks of delayed supply delivery. She had told no one about the back route. It was not exactly surveillance. It was more like a gap in a wall that she happened to be able to see through, and for 6 months she had been able to see the ordinary administrative traffic of a working station, which had been genuinely useful for her cultural research. Then 3 days ago, the gap had passed through a partial transmission log from the Veth Fleet Operations tier, and in that log was something that had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. The Veth had 6 unmanned strike platforms in low orbit around Earth. Not weapons, technically, in their own infrastructure records. They were listed as survey arrays in the administrative documentation she could access through normal channels. She had known something was wrong about them for 4 months. The orbital decay patterns she'd been able to observe were inconsistent with passive instruments. The power signatures were wrong. The maintenance schedules were classified at a level that survey equipment had no reason to require. But she hadn't had confirmation until the transmission log had come through the gap, and she had read in the flat bureaucratic language of Veth Fleet Operations, the coordinates, the yield calculations, the activation protocols, and the standing orders. The platforms were to be activated in the event of a diplomatic failure classified as hostile. She had sat with that for a very long time, alone in her quarters on a Tuesday night with the sound of the station going on around her, and the star map on the wall and the small clay pot on the desk. And she had done the math that she had not wanted to do. The formal rejection of humanity's diplomatic credentials, under Veth conclave law, would be classified as a hostile diplomatic failure. She had the access through the back route, not the activation codes, those she couldn't reach, but network access to the platform's communication arrays. She could broadcast from there. She could make what she had found the loudest, most public thing that had ever come out of this station. She could put the coordinates, the yield calculations, the standing orders, the activation protocols, all of it, on every channel she had access to, in both formal conclave notation and the working language dialect that the ordinary Veth of this station actually read. She could make sure every monitoring system, every recorder, every junior bureaucrat who happened to be on duty recorded the moment when the human envoy told the Veth conclave that their secret had been seen. She could make them afraid. She had lain awake thinking about what that fear would do. A civilization that had maintained 6 orbital sterilization platforms over an inhabited planet for 40 years and classified them as survey arrays was not a civilization that was naive about the implications of what it had built. It was a civilization that had decided the platforms were justified and the deception was worth maintaining. The Veth response to being exposed, she had read enough of their history to know this pattern, was not contrition. The Veth response to being cornered, to having their calculations disrupted by unexpected information, was escalation. They called it restoration of terms, which was the bureaucratic phrase for the thing that happened when someone upset the balance of an arrangement that had been working, from the Veth perspective, perfectly well. If she broadcast, they might activate the platforms before anyone on Earth could do anything about it. If she broadcast and they did not activate immediately, the conclave would spend the next several cycles in crisis management. And in crisis management, the voices calling for restoration of terms would be louder than any other voice in the room. She had sat in enough conclave observation sessions to know what happened when the room went loud. She had kept coming back to the same math. If she used what she had, she might save the relationship and she might end the planet, and she had no reliable way to know which. She had also kept coming back to something else. She had spent 2 years building a record, not a threat, not leverage. A record of who humans were, how they thought, what they valued, what they did when they were afraid, what they did when they were treated with contempt, how they responded to generosity versus how they responded to hostility. She had believed and still believed that the record itself was the thing that mattered, that the slow, patient accumulation of evidence that humans were worth knowing was the only play that had any chance of working long-term. Threats worked until they didn't. Fear worked until the fear became resentment, and the resentment became exactly the thing the threat was meant to prevent. She had found in her research an obscure Veth mechanism from the pre-consolidation era called resonant debt. She had found it 6 months ago, in a collection of legal records from a period of Veth history that modern Veth tended to regard the way humans regarded the parts of their own past that were complicated and inconvenient. The pre-consolidation era was the period before the current conclave structure, when the Veth had been organized as competing city-states in frequent conflict, and the era had produced institutions born specifically from the necessity of finding ways to stop destroying each other. Resonant debt was one of those institutions. When two powers were locked in a cycle of retaliation that was destroying both of them, a third party could invoke resonant debt, a formal acknowledgement that the debt between two parties had grown so large that neither could collect it without annihilating themselves in the collecting. The invoker of resonant debt offered no payment, made no submission, simply placed the record of the debt in the public archive and said, "This exists, we all know it exists, we can all see exactly what it costs, and we choose to let it stand uncollected because the alternative is mutual destruction." It was not forgiveness. The Veth had no word for forgiveness that Sira had ever been able to find. Resonant debt was something more pragmatic, something that operated not on the level of sentiment, but on the level of calculation. It said not that the debt was forgiven, but that the debt was acknowledged, and the collection was refused, not out of generosity, but out of the clear-eyed recognition that collection was impossible without catastrophe. It was the language of a civilization that didn't have a word for letting go, but had found a way to do it anyway. That was why she thought it might work. She had 6 hours. She opened 3 channels simultaneously, and she started to write. The first was a formal petition to the Veth Conclave's Legal Archive Division, invoking resonant debt under the pre-consolidation framework, Statute 7, Subarticle 4. She attached the full documentation, the existence of the 6 orbital platforms, their yield calculations, their orbital parameters, their classification history as survey arrays, the transmission log excerpt that demonstrated the senior fleet operations tier had been fully aware of the standing orders throughout the entirety of the diplomatic process. She wrote it in high formal Veth, the specific register of the conclave's legal record, the one that, once submitted through the proper channel, could not be expunged without a full council vote that would itself become part of the permanent record, readable by every Veth citizen with archive access in perpetuity. She had been studying that register for 8 months, waiting to find something important enough to justify using it. This felt like the moment. She spent 2 hours writing it. She wrote it the way she wrote her field journals, precisely and completely, with no rhetorical flourishes that might be misread by a species for whom rhetorical flourish was always an expression of status rather than emphasis. She said what she had found, how she had found it, what it meant under Veth law, and what she was choosing not to do with it and why. The second channel was a message to the retired fleet admiral, weight of accumulated victories in the formal records, the man she had spent several months drinking something adjacent to coffee within one of the station's working-tier commissaries, talking around the edges of a war that had ended before she was born, and left its mark on both their civilizations in ways that neither side had fully mapped. The message took longer than the legal petition, which surprised her. She wrote 3 versions. The first was too careful, too formal, too aware of the audience. The second was too personal, too much of her own fear on the surface. The third was what she actually meant. She wrote, "You told me I reminded you of the kind of soldier you had wished your enemies were. I want to tell you what that means to a human. When we say that about someone, when we say that, we are saying that the thing we feared about them was also the thing we respected, and that the respect was real even though the fear was real. You gave me something significant when you said that. I want to give you something back. We have a concept for which I could not find a Veth equivalent, and I spent 6 months looking. The concept is this, that the most powerful thing you can do with a weapon is choose not to use it, and then allow the person who gave you the reason to see that choice clearly without concealment and let them carry that forward into whatever they decide next. We call it forgiveness. It is not the absence of the record. The record exists. I am placing it in your archive, but I am not broadcasting it. I am not using it as a threat. I am not even asking you to do anything specific with it. I am leaving you the account of what your conclave has built, and I am trusting you to decide what that means. This is the most human thing I know how to do. I'm also doing it because I think about 8 billion specific people who go about their specific days, not knowing that 6 weapons have been aimed at them for 40 years. And I would rather do the thing that keeps them alive than the thing that satisfies the part of me that is very angry right now. And I am doing it because you told me. I reminded you of the kind of soldier you had wished your enemies were, and I would like that to remain true." She sent it. She sat for a moment with the sent confirmation on the screen, feeling the specific lightness of a thing that can't be undone. Then she opened the third channel, which was the ambient recorder she had been running as a personal documentation project since her first week on the station, not for broadcast, not for the conclave's records, just for hers. She packaged it with a timestamp and a note for the UN Diplomatic Corps. This is what it looked like from here, for whoever finds this useful, and she forwarded it to their secure archive on a 3-day delay she could cancel if she changed her mind. She did not change her mind. She finished packing. She closed the cases. She looked at the star maps on the wall for a moment, the ones she'd pinned there herself over 2 years of long evenings, the ones that showed the sky from multiple reference points, because she had never been able to look at a star map without wanting to know what it looked like from somewhere else. She had made digital copies of all of them. She left the physical maps on the wall. Let them wonder. The transit pod was exactly as small as holds the record of costs had implied. She loaded what she could of the archival cases and stood in the cargo space calculating what was going to be left behind. She made 3 choices. She kept the field journals, all 8 of them. She kept the cultural reference archive, as many drives as she could fit. She left the duplicate star maps. They were already backed up. She left a data chip with the overflow documentation on her desk with a note written in the working language trade dialect of the station's dock workers. Not the formal conclave register, not the formal diplomatic tongue, but the rough language of the people who moved things around and kept records of what arrived and what didn't. The note said, "These belong to the record. Whoever reads this, please keep them somewhere they won't be thrown away." She shouldered her bag, took one last look at the small clay pot on the desk, changed her mind and put it in the bag instead. Then she left. The corridor was quiet at this hour, or whatever this hour counted as on a station where shift cycles didn't match any planet's rotation. The overhead lights were in their mid-cycle dimming, the maintenance bots had finished their passes, and the ambient noise was the skeleton crew of overnight equivalent operations. Her footsteps sounded loud and specific. She was halfway to the shuttle bay when she heard footsteps behind her. Not the 4-beat Veth gate. Something heavier, more deliberate, with the particular weight of someone who was moving purposefully rather than on an automatic route. She turned. The Admiral was not in ceremonial dress. He wore the plain dark carapace covering of working hours, the kind that had no rank insignia and no institutional markings, which meant he had not come from anything official and was not making this official. He was old, by Veth reckoning. His bioluminescent filaments had dimmed from the vivid colors of active service to a deep amber, the color that the Veth associate with someone who has spent their brightness and is operating on what they have left, which they told her was not a diminishment but a different kind of abundance. He was looking at her with an expression she had worked hard at for months and still found difficult to fully decode. "You sent the resident debt petition," he said. "I did. It will take the Legal Archive Division approximately 30 hours to process it. The full council review will take longer." His filaments pulsed. "Much longer." "I know. You will be in transit during that time. You will have no access to the proceedings." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. In the corridor's working light, low and amber-tinged, his filaments pulsed through a sequence she had documented carefully across multiple conversations and still found genuinely resistant to interpretation. Something in the range of contemplation crossed with something she had tentatively categorized as reluctant respect, though she had been uncertain enough about that categorization to mark it with 3 question marks in her field journal. "The strike platforms," he said finally. "You did not broadcast this." "No." "You had access to do so." "Yes." "You chose not to." "Yes." He was quiet again. She had learned to wait out the Veth silences. Most humans couldn't, found them unbearable, felt the social pressure of unfilled space and rushed to fill it with something, anything, usually the wrong thing. She had trained herself out of that reflex over 22 months. She stood in the corridor and let him think at her in whatever way he needed to, and she breathed steadily, and she waited. "Why?" he said finally. A single word, and it was in the working language dialect, not the formal register of their usual conversations, not the high conclave tongue she'd addressed him in for most of their exchanges. The rough language of the dock workers, the language of saying what you actually meant. She took a breath. She answered in the same dialect, "Because I came here to build something, not to end something. And because if I broadcast it, people die. Maybe everyone I know, maybe more than that. And even if the platforms don't fire immediately, even if there's a political outcome that prevents that, I've changed what this is. I've made this relationship about what we can threaten each other with. And that's not what I came here to do." She paused, organizing the next part. "And because you told me, I reminded you of the kind of soldier you had wished your enemies were. I didn't want to prove you wrong about that." He looked at her for a long time without speaking. His filaments cycled through patterns she couldn't catalog fast enough. "Your species has a word for this," he said, not asking, confirming something. "We have a word. It's harder than it sounds." A pause. Then unexpectedly, "Yes, it would be." She waited. "The transit pod," he said, in a shift of register that was itself a kind of answer to the thing they'd been talking about, "is inadequate for your equipment. I have arranged a cargo shuttle from my personal fleet allocation. It will carry everything, including the archival drives you left on your desk." She blinked. She started. "I am not doing it for you," he said, with a very specific precision in his filament pattern that she recognized, after 2 years, as the closest thing the Veth had to a dry joke. "I am doing it because your cultural archive represents a research resource of significant value to the Conclave's academic institutions, and it would be wasteful and inefficient to lose that documentation." He paused. "That is what I will record as my reason." "That makes complete sense," she said. "That's an entirely reasonable reason." His filaments pulsed in the pattern she had tentatively classified as the nearest Veth equivalent to a rueful smile, though she had always been less than certain about that one. "Sira Voss," he said, and she noticed he had used her actual name rather than the formal designation she'd been given for the station, another working dialect marker, a choice. "What you have placed in the legal archive will take time. The full council will argue for many cycles. There are those who will move to expunge the record. There are others who will not allow that. There are some who will want to activate the platforms as a matter of principle, as restoration of terms." There are others who will not. The result is genuinely uncertain. I know. You may have accomplished nothing. That's possible. You may have accomplished everything. She looked at him steadily. Also possible. How do your people live with that? It was a genuine question, she could tell. The filaments were in the pattern she had categorized as actual curiosity rather than rhetorical performance, and she had spent enough time with him to know the difference. She thought about it honestly, the way a question that deserved a real answer deserved real thought rather than a prepared response. She thought about her grandmother folding letters, about her niece making a clay pot with small, careful hands, about a subway platform in summer heat and the particular weight of being somewhere ordinary and alive, about what it felt like to walk out of this corridor and get into a shuttle and not know for certain what came next. One day at a time, she said, and we keep the record clear so whoever comes after us knows what we were trying to do, even if it didn't work, even if no one ever reads it. The record exists. She paused. We do it because we can't stand the thought of not doing it. That's probably the most honest answer. He held her gaze in a way she had never fully decoded. The eyes didn't track the way mammalian eyes did. The expression didn't live in the face the way human expression did. But she had learned over 2 years to feel the weight of his attention, and she felt it now as something heavy and careful and specific. Then he inclined his head. Not the formal conclave bow that came in 7 distinct variants with 7 distinct meanings. Not the submission gesture of lower to higher tier. Not any gesture she had in her documented catalog. It was something smaller and more considered than any ceremony she'd observed. The kind of gesture that had apparently not been created for documentation, but for this particular moment. Safe travel, he said. In the working dialect. She returned the incline, felt that it was the right response, though she couldn't have cited a source. Keep the archive safe, she said. Then she walked down the corridor toward the cargo shuttle, her bag over one shoulder, not running, not looking back, not performing anything. The station hummed around her with the ordinary sound of a civilization in the middle of its ordinary night, and she walked through it as she had walked through it for 2 years, present and human and keeping the record. The cargo shuttle was large enough. She loaded everything, including the 47 archival drives and the data chip from her desk, which had apparently already been retrieved and packed by someone she didn't see. She found the clay pot still in her bag and set it on the navigator's console where she could see it during the 14-hour transit. She was out of the station's traffic buffer and into open space when her hands started shaking. She hadn't noticed until she looked down at them. They were resting on the console, palm down, and they were shaking with the fine, involuntary tremor of a body that had been holding something tense for a very long time and had only just been told it was allowed to stop. She looked at them for a while. She didn't try to make them stop. The body knew things the mind was still catching up to, and what the body knew was that the cost had been real and was only now being felt. She was an hour out of the station, Earth still 12 hours away and invisible, when she started humming. It wasn't something she decided to do. It was something that happened the way things happen when the mind has been working very hard for a very long time and finally runs out of whatever it uses to keep certain things in their proper places. The melody that came out was the one her grandmother had sung, a low, wandering, tuneless sort of thing that had no name she'd ever known, that her grandmother had probably made up from nothing specific, that had the particular quality of music that doesn't exist to be beautiful or meaningful, but only to make the dark a little smaller for whoever is sitting in it. She hummed it for a while. She didn't know that the shuttle's ambient recording system was running. She didn't know that the Admiral had ensured, before the shuttle departed, that the ambient recording system would run continuously and automatically throughout the transit, capturing everything. The star maps visible through the viewport, the clay pot on the navigator's console, the 47 archival drives stacked in the cargo hold, the shaking hands gradually going still, the tuneless lullaby, the long silences between, the particular quality of someone who has done what they came to do and is now just traveling. She didn't know that the recording of those 14 hours would be entered into the Veth Conclave's cultural archive under the heading, Human Behavior Category, Incomprehensible Subcategory, under active study. She didn't know that the Admiral would play a 30-second excerpt of it, just the lullaby, the stars, the clay pot, the hands going still for his students every year for the next 30 years, and would ask them a question that he said he could not answer himself. This being had the means to destroy us and did not use them, and did not ask us to be grateful. She did not ask for an apology. She did not demand accountability. She placed the record in our archive and she went home. Tell me what word your language has for this. Tell me if you think we need one. She didn't know that the full council debate would run for 47 days, that 6 members would move to expunge the record, that 4 would move to activate the platforms immediately on the grounds that the exposure of their existence was itself a hostile act, that 9 members would eventually vote in favor of invoking the full pre-consolidation resident debt statute, that the Admiral's 6-hour speech would become a subject of study in Veth political philosophy programs for the next generation, that the specific passage where he played the 30-second recording had been reported by attendees to have produced a silence in the council chamber that lasted nearly 4 minutes. She didn't know that the strike platforms were decommissioned 18 months later in a closed ceremony that was, by all accounts, conducted in the working language dialect rather than formal conclave notation, on the Admiral's specific request. She didn't know that 11 years after she walked down that corridor and got into that shuttle, a young Veth diplomat, 3rd tier, recent posting, carapace the fresh bronze of someone who hasn't been anywhere yet, would arrive at Earth's new liaison station carrying a translation project she had started as a student. She had been looking for the nearest Veth equivalent to the human concept of forgiveness, which her instructor had told her didn't exist in their language, and she had refused to accept that as an answer, and she had found it eventually in a philosophical text from the pre-consolidation era, and it translated, approximately, as the release of an account that has been paid in full by the bearing of it. She brought it with her as a gift. She had memorized the Veth phrase for it and the specific context of its use, and she recited it to the first human official who greeted her at the station door, a junior protocol officer who had no idea what he was receiving, but recorded it carefully in the intake log. Sira Voss was teaching a graduate seminar on xenocultural diplomacy at the University of Cape Town when she got the notification from the diplomatic corps. She was mid-sentence, standing at the board with her back to the room, when her communicator vibrated in the specific pattern she'd set years ago for high-priority items from the corps. She finished her sentence. She told her class to take 10 minutes. She sat at her desk by the window that looked out on the late afternoon path below, students walking, the particular angle of winter light on the building across, the smell of coffee from the department kitchen, and she read the notification. It described the Veth Conclave's new diplomatic mission to Earth. It described the formal introductory documentation the mission had filed. It described the section of that documentation titled Account of Debts. She read that section twice. The account of debts itemized what had been built and when, and what had been maintained and for how long, and what had been decided over 47 days of council debate, and what the turning point had been, and whose name was attached to it. It used formal Veth legal notation throughout, which she had always found more honest than decorated prose. The notation said what it meant with the precision of something that had to stand in the archive forever. What it said, in that notation, was, a human chose not to collect a debt that would have been justified to collect, and that choice altered the terms of what was possible. She folded the notification. She creased it down the center with her thumbnail. She put it in the drawer where she kept things that mattered. Then her student Amara knocked and put her head around the door to say the class was ready, and also that something had been left for her at the reception desk. A small package wrapped in dark Veth carapace cloth. No sender information. She opened it carefully. Inside was a smooth gray stone. Not hull plating. The actual mineral, the precise composition that marked, in pre-consolidation Veth tradition, someone who worked with their hands, someone whose labor was real and left evidence of itself on the world. With it was a small card printed in the high formal Veth register, which she translated without any difficulty, because she had spent 22 months learning every register there was. The card said, "The account has been entered into the permanent record. The debt stands uncollected. This is what it cost, and we are grateful for it." She held the stone for a while. It was cold and dense and very specific, a particular thing from a particular place, carrying the weight of whoever had chosen it and wrapped it and sent it across however many years and kilometers to arrive on a desk in Cape Town next to a small clay pot with a chip in the rim. She set it down carefully in the afternoon light next to the clay pot. The two objects sat together on the desk, the human thing made by a child's careful hands 11 years ago, and the alien thing sent from a civilization that had spent 40 years aiming weapons at a planet and then had not used them and had wanted, after everything, to send evidence that something had changed. They were different shapes, different materials, different origins. They rested in the same light. She picked up her notes. "Amara," she said, "tell them I'll be right there." After her student left, she stood for a moment more, looking at the two objects on the desk, and she thought about the record, the long specific record of everything that had happened and everything it had cost, and everything it might still become, running forward from a Thursday morning in an alien space station through 47 days of council debate and 18 months of decommissioning, and 11 years of ordinary work to this afternoon light, this desk, this stone, this pot. The record existed. It was in the Veth Legal Archive, and the UN Diplomatic Corps secure server and 8 field journals in her filing cabinet, and the memory of a retired fleet admiral asking his students an unanswerable question, and it would keep accumulating, imperfect and specific and real. She went to teach her class. Outside, the ordinary afternoon continued without knowing any of it. The students on the path did not know about 6 survey arrays that had not been survey arrays, or about a woman in a transit pod with shaking hands who had hummed a lullaby in the dark between 2 civilizations. They were just people going about the specific business of their lives, which was exactly what 8 billion people had been doing when someone with every reason in the known universe to cause destruction had decided that the most powerful thing available to her was the choice not to. Most of them would never know. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. Somewhere in the Veth Conclave's academic archive, a recording was playing for a room full of students who had been asked to find a word. And in the permanent public record of the Veth Legal Archive, under Resonant Debt, Pre-Consolidation Framework, Statute 7, Subarticle 4, cross-reference to a diplomatic case that had altered the trajectory of 2 civilizations and the survival of one of them, a single human name sat in the cold formal notation of an alien bureaucracy. Not as a threat, not as a victory, as the name of someone who had understood something that had no word in their language yet, and who had done it anyway in the dark with shaking hands, humming a song her grandmother had made up from nothing on the way home. They were still working on the word. But that was all later. In the hours between the sending of the petition and the departure of the shuttle, there was still the station, and Sira still had 3 hours left in it. She didn't spend them hiding. She had never spent any of her time on the station hiding. She had walked its corridors from her first week there, with the specific deliberateness of someone who understood that invisibility was a choice that came at a cost, that the only way to make a relationship between species real was to be present in it, And that presence meant accepting that you would be seen doing the ordinary, undignified work of being alive in a place that wasn't built for you. She had eaten in the working tier commissaries, sitting at the low tables designed for Veth-leg geometry, and making do with the wrong height while she talked to dock supervisors and maintenance technicians, and the occasional junior bureaucrat who was curious enough to actually sit down across from the human. She had walked through the cargo processing halls during active shifts and asked questions about what was being moved and where it was going, which was apparently a behavior so unusual in anyone above the working tier that it had become, among the dock workers, a mild point of interest, the human who asked questions about freight. She walked the corridors now for the same reason she had always walked them, to be present in the place one more time, to have the record include this last pass, to let herself see it clearly instead of only in the anxious blur of packing and leaving. The station was doing what it always did. The overnight shift was thinner than the day complement but not empty. This was a working facility and work didn't stop because a human's credentials had been revoked. The cargo manifests were being processed, the environmental systems were being maintained, the long, low-frequency hum of the pressurization arrays was doing its patient, continuous work. She passed 2 dock workers running a freight cart toward the loading bay, and one of them. She had talked to him 3 months ago about a cargo routing issue, and he had explained the Veth logistical classification system with the patient precision of someone who genuinely loved the elegance of it, glanced at her, and then looked away, and then looked back, and she thought she saw, in the brief filament flicker of his expression, something she would have called acknowledgement in a human face. She nodded at him. He did not return it, which was fine. Acknowledgement between tiers was complicated, and she had never expected it to be otherwise. She stopped at the commissary. It was nearly empty at this hour. One junior technical officer working through what looked like shift-end paperwork in the far corner. The automated dispenser putting out the mineral supplement drinks the Veth working tier favored. She got a cup of the human coffee she'd been importing since month 2. She had never managed to find a Veth analog that did the same thing for her brain, and had eventually stopped looking, and stood at the counter and drank it slowly. The coffee was from a small cooperative in the Western Ghats that her cultural attaché back home had recommended as the best supplier for long-distance orders. She had been drinking it for 22 months and had never switched, and standing there she thought about how specific that was, how the ordinary specific choices accumulated into a life, and how she was about to take this particular specific life and move it to a different place. She thought about what she'd sent. Not the legal petition. She had confidence in the legal petition the way you had confidence in a well-constructed argument. It would do what it was supposed to do, make the record it was supposed to make, and what happened after that was out of her hands. She thought about the message to the Admiral, the specific words she had used, the way she had tried to translate something that might not translate, and had sent it anyway because the attempt mattered even if the translation failed. She thought about the word her species had for the thing she'd done, and whether it was exactly accurate. Forgiveness, she had always understood, was a word that carried more weight in the speaking than in the understanding of it. People used it to mean anything from the erasure of consequence to the internal private act of releasing a grievance to the radical relational act of continuing to engage with someone who had wronged you. It got flattened into a virtue word, a word that got deployed in contexts where it was expected to function as a solution without anyone having to specify what exactly was being solved. She had written in her field journals, at some point in the middle of the 2nd year, that she thought the reason humans reached for the word so often in spaces where it didn't quite fit was that it named something real and difficult and genuinely important, and they hadn't found a better word yet. She hadn't used the word in the message to the Admiral, she realized. She had described the thing. She had said, "The most powerful thing you can do with a weapon is choose not to use it." She had said, "I am leaving you the account and I am trusting you to decide what to do with it." She had said, This is the most human thing I know how to do. She had not said the word. Maybe that was right. Maybe the concept was more legible without the label, to a mind that didn't have the label's centuries of accumulated usage distorting the meaning. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the cup in the dispenser's cleaning slot, which was a human behavior that no vet would ever have performed because the dispenser included automated cleaning, but which she did anyway because she had been raised to clean up after herself, and there were some reflexes that 22 months in space hadn't touched. Then she went back to her quarters, collected her bags, and walked to the shuttle bay. The Admiral was not there again, which was as it should be. He had done what he came to do, and he had said what he came to say, and the rest was the ordinary mechanics of departure. The cargo shuttle, pre-flight running. The dock workers wrote safety confirmation that she understood now well enough to follow without the translator. The specific sound of the umbilical seals releasing. The feeling of the station's gravity field letting go, and the shuttle's own systems taking over. She was moving. 14 hours. She sat at the navigator's console, and she looked out at the stars, which from this angle were the specific stars of this specific departure. She would never see them from exactly this angle again. The station behind her and Veth prime off to the left, and its moon in shadow, and Earth somewhere ahead in the invisible dark. And she thought about the 47 archival drives in the cargo hold, and the field journals stacked in order. And what it meant to carry all of that back, to a planet that had sent her out here with the hope that she would come back with something. She was coming back with something. She wasn't sure yet what it would mean. The resident debt petition was in the legal archive, being processed, and the Admiral had her message, and the full council would debate, and the strike platform still existed, and the standing orders might still be active, and she was 14 hours away from the nearest human ship, and moving at the pace a cargo shuttle moved, and there was absolutely nothing she could do now except be in transit and let the record do what records did. She had done everything she could do, she was sure of that. She was also, and this was the more honest truth under the sureness, very afraid. Not for herself specifically. She had examined that fear carefully during the 72 hours when she'd been sitting with the targeting data, and trying to find the play that didn't end with 8 billion deaths, and she had found that her own safety was genuinely lower on the list than she would have expected, that what was underneath the fear was not the personal fear of a woman in a bad situation, but the larger fear of someone who understood the stakes clearly, and was not at all confident that she had found the right answer. She had made the best decision she could make with the information and the values she had, and she knew that, and she also knew that the best decision she could make was not the same thing as the right decision, and there was no way to know yet which this was. That was what she had said to the Admiral. How do your people live with that? And she had answered one day at a time, and that was true, and it was also not a complete answer. The more complete answer was that you lived with it by accepting that certainty was not on offer, and that the absence of certainty was not the same as the absence of meaning, and you kept the record so that if you were wrong there was at least evidence of what you had been trying to do, and you did the next thing, and the next thing, and you did not wait until you were sure to act because sure was not something that ever actually arrived. She thought about her niece. She was 8 now. She had been 6 when Sira left. She had made the clay pot in a craft class and had given it to Sira as a going-away present, solemn and serious about it, the way 6-year-olds were solemn and serious about things that mattered to them, and Sira had said she would keep it safe, and had kept that promise across 22 months and 400 million kilometers. She thought about introducing her niece to the concept of resident debt when she was old enough. She thought about what it would mean to grow up in a world where the debt had been entered into the permanent record and was being held uncollected on both sides, where there was a Veth diplomat at a station on Earth and a human diplomatic mission being reestablished, and the record was being built in both directions at once. She thought about what kind of world that was to grow up into imperfect and complicated, and still full of weapons that existed and couldn't be pretended away, but also full of something harder to name and probably more durable. The lullaby started somewhere around the third hour. She didn't decide to hum it. It happened the way it always happened with things her grandmother had given her, not as a performance but as a reflex, the way the body reached for familiar things when it needed to remember that familiar things existed. She hummed it for a long time, and the stars stayed where they were, and the cargo shuttle kept moving, and somewhere in the legal archive of a civilization she had spent 2 years learning to understand, a document was being processed that said, "We know what exists, we have chosen not to collect it. This is the record of that choice, and the name of the person who made it first." She hummed until she fell asleep, her cheek against the headrest, the clay pot still on the console in front of her, the stars unchanging outside the viewport. She slept without dreaming, which was not something she had managed since the targeting data arrived, and which meant something her body knew that her mind was still figuring out. She was home in 14 hours. She had work to do. 3 years after the decommissioning of the platforms, the Veth Conclave published its first open translation of the pre-consolidation philosophical texts. The academic project was led by the same young diplomat, now second tier, and stationed permanently on Earth, and it included the text where she had found the nearest Veth equivalent to forgiveness, the release of an account that has been paid in full by the bearing of it. The translation was published in 17 Earth languages simultaneously, which was, the foreword noted, in both Veth formal notation and plain English, not a symbolic gesture but a practical one. These concepts, the foreword said, do not belong to the civilization that found words for them. They belong to whatever civilization found the practice of them. The foreword was unsigned. Sira read it in her office on a Friday morning. A good day, she thought. A day that had some weight to it, with the clay pot and the gray stone side by side on her desk, and her 8th field journal open to a blank page. She picked up an ink stylus, and she made a note, precise and complete the way she had been trained to make notes, the way she had made notes for 2 years in a space station that had eventually decided it didn't want her. The note said, "This is what the record looks like today. This is what it can become. This is what it cost to get here." She capped the stylus. She closed the journal. She sat for a moment with the morning light and the 2 objects on her desk, and the fact of Friday, which was a good day, and she thought that this was the nature of the work, not the dramatic choice, not the trembling hands in the dark, not even the moment of decision, but the long, ordinary continuation of it, the showing up and the note-taking and the teaching and the learning and the daily practice of the thing you had decided, alone in a shuttle between stars, was worth doing. Outside, her niece was waiting in the corridor. She was 11 now, home from school for the weekend, and she had come to her aunt's office specifically to see the gray stone, which Sira had told her about and which she had decided she wanted to examine for herself. She was at the age where she was very serious about examining things. Sira opened the door. "Is that it?" her niece said, pointing at the stone on the desk. "That's it. Can I hold it?" "Yes." Her niece picked it up with both hands, the careful, serious way she held things that mattered, and turned it in the light. It was not a dramatic-looking object. It was smooth and gray and dense, the color of nothing special, the weight of something real. "The Veth sent this," she said. "A Veth sent it. It took 11 years to arrive." Her niece considered this. Why did it take so long? "Because some things take the time they take," Sira said. "You can't make them go faster by wanting them to." Her niece thought about this with the expression of someone filing the information in a place she would come back to later. Then she set the stone back down next to the clay pot, carefully, and looked at both of them together. "They look like they belong together," she said. Sira looked at the 2 objects on the desk in the morning light. The small, rough human thing and the small, smooth alien thing, resting together in the same space that had been made for both of them, belonging together because Someone had made choices that let them belong together, because two civilizations had done the hard and imprecise work of staying in relation with each other across the distance of everything they didn't yet understand about each other. Yes, she said, they do.